Today's conversation is inspired by the Reverend Peter Jarrett-Schell's Reparations, A Plan for Churches. And he's joined by the Reverend Canon Stephanie Spellers, author of The Church Cracked Open, Disruption, Decline, and New Hope for Beloved Community. Pastor Peter Jarrett-Schell is the rector of Calvary Episcopal Church in Washington, D.C., and has served as chair of the Episcopal Diocese of Washington's Task Force on Reparations, which was charged with developing the diocese reparations plan. In addition to Reparations, A Plan for Churches, he's the author of Seeing My Skin, A Story of Wrestling with Whiteness. Also joining us is Canon Stephanie Spellers, who serves in the Episcopal Church as the canon to the presiding bishop for evangelism, reconciliation, and creation care. She has also taught at the General Theological Seminary and served in the Episcopal Diocese of Long Island. In addition to The Church Cracked Open, she's the author of numerous books, including Radical Welcome, Embracing God and the Other, and the Spirit of Transformation. I'd like to open the webinar by inviting Canon Stephanie to lead us in prayer. Canon Stephanie.
Thank you so much, Justin, and thank you everyone for joining us for what I know is going to be a really life-giving conversation. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let us pray. Holy God, you are truly the giver of all things, including this very life we live and the very breath that we take in. We ask you now to be present, O Lord. Be present in our learning, be present in our sharing, be present as we discover ways to take brave new steps and to support one another in living more fully into your dream for beloved community. In the name of Jesus, we lift it all up to you. And just together say amen, amen,
amen,
and amen. So Brother Peter, thank you for this wonderful, wonderful book. But more than that, more than thank you for writing Reparations, A Plan for the Church, and for listening to so many other leaders and bringing these voices together. Thank you for caring and for making your own commitments to ideas, to directions that a lot of folk may find really difficult. And so I just want to start. I bet you do. I'm sure you'd, and honestly, if it weren't difficult, then we'd have a problem, right? Like if you didn't think it was hard. What I'm wondering about, even as we begin this conversation, eventually we're going to focus more on Memorial Church in Baltimore. I know the example of that church well. You've detailed it in your book. But even before we get into that, I would really love for you to just share some with folks about why reparations and how has your heart been opened and turned toward this kind of sacrifice and transformation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So thank you. So I'm a pastor, so I think about it, the question of like, why is this necessary in spiritual terms, partly. And thinking about it in spiritual terms, I try and look for where we have resources to help us think about this. So two that might be kind of surprising. One came up for me when I was watching Daniel Tiger with my son, which if you're not familiar with it, is the sort of following sequence, like the sequel series to Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood is created by the same folks. And they kind of offer all of these kind of moral and emotional lessons that are put in song. And there's one that was about Daniel Tiger does something that kind of offends his friend. And he says, well, why, like I said, sorry. So like, why is she still upset with me? And the teacher kind of leads us through this song. And the song is, and I'm gonna get the tune wrong because I have a terrible voice, but it's saying, I'm sorry is the first step. Next comes, how can I help? And it's like this principle that we understand that once we've acknowledged that we've done harm, that there is kind of an obligation to try and do what we can to make it right. Now, I say that with some qualification because you have to recognize the limits of what's possible, and you also have to do it in a way that's really about making things right for the person you've hurt rather than kind of satisfying your own emotional need. So another place, like another resource that I would look to that's familiar to many of our congregations is 12-step spirituality. And if you know the 12 steps, the 8th one is about making this fearless moral inventory and being willing to make amends. And the 9th step specifically states, I'm not going to get the wording right, but people who are familiar will know it, that you make amends in every case where it's possible where doing so would not further harm the person that you have wronged. And so that's kind of a critical piece, that it's really attentive to the needs of the other person that's been harmed in this relationship. Reparations, basically, I would say morally is kind of necessary, because when we acknowledge that there have been harms that we have participated in and benefited from that continue to sabotage an individual or community, if we're really serious about making it right, we've got to figure out what we can do to address that. Reparations, I'd say in financial terms, which is a piece of it, it's not the whole thing, but it's part of what we talk about, I think is necessary for a couple of reasons. And these are spiritual reasons, but also practical. Spiritually speaking, Jesus teaches us where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. And I think that's just a fact that we can recognize in our own lives when we look at our budgets, our personal budgets in our lives. We put money towards things that matter to us. And I think that we can see that there's an example of how in our own lives, how that money both leads and follows where our heart is, right? So you give money towards things that matter to you. Once you've actually given money in a substantial level towards something, then you really care about it because you've invested and you want to be sure that you see good outcomes. And part of what that means regarding this question, when we're acknowledging the harms that our predominantly white institutions have inflicted and perpetuate still against the Black community, is that unless we are actually willing to put our money where our mouth is, necessarily our commitment to reconciliation is insincere and will be insincere until we're willing to do that. But the other piece is practical. And I mean, that's not unspiritual, but it is practical. When we look at the racial injustices that continue in this country, when we look at all the vast disparities that exist between the white and Black community, and when you're measuring like in every area, health outcomes, what happens when you go to the hospital and how you're received, what your pay is going to be, the likelihood you're going to get called back from a job, what the environmental conditions of your neighborhood, all of these things. These are all conditioned by wealth level, and that's really, clear. And I don't want to say, I want to be clear about this, like money can't fix every problem, but in this country, wealth conditions every single problem. And when we recognize that there is a 10-to-1 wealth gap between the Black community and white community in this country, we have to acknowledge that there is no path that will get us towards equity that does not address that inequity, that specific inequity head on. So that's, we're going to require a transfer of assets. And I would say that a lot of our efforts at racial justice that are somehow suspicious or unwilling to tackle the question of reparations are basically examples of us trying to sort of clever our way out of this problem, which we do a lot. Like we try and figure out clever solutions that won't require us to surrender these plundered assets, and they are plundered assets. And there's simply no way to get there. So that's kind of how I think about what the reparation is. It's partly just the acknowledgement that when there's been a harm, when we have some capacity to do something about it, we are obliged to do it, or else our commitment towards reconciliation and restoration is necessarily insincere. But it is kind of as comes out in that ninth step of 12-step spirituality, it's a proximate thing. Like it's an acknowledgement that there are harms that can never, ever be paid for. And even to suggest that you could pay for them is deeply insulting. It doesn't absolve us of the obligation to try. But there's a limit to what can be accomplished in these ways, and yet it's necessary. So the formula that we've kind of always lifted up doing this work in the Diocese of Washington is that reparations, and specifically financial reparations, are necessary but insufficient for any project of racial justice. It won't accomplish it by itself, but unless you're willing to tackle that and really make reparation, you're never going to get to where you need to be. So that's kind of how I think about it.
Wow. Thank you so much for, again, not just sharing what you did just now, but for dwelling with the questions so deeply. It's scary territory for a lot of people.
It is. Yeah,
I know.
absolutely.
There are folk who, like they'll be on board with you for racial justice, on board with you around reconciliation, healing. The moment the word reparations drops into the conversation, they seize up.
Yep. Absolutely.
And so I think the kind of theological and practical approach that you've described in your book and that you're outlining even right now I think gives us a lot to chew on and hopefully a lot to pray with.
Hope so.
Now, of course, there are many churches, many Episcopal institutions, many institutions, period, who have pursued reparations in various ways. Today, we're going to do a bit of a kind of laser focus on one of those institutions. And of course, that's Memorial Episcopal Church in Baltimore. The church was founded in 1860, which automatically ought to flash some things for folks like, wait, 1860, isn't that close to, like some action around the Civil War? And the truth is that the church, as they've done their historic work, they have seen in detail their own complicity around slavery, around racism, and have thus engaged in some pretty significant reparations programs. And so maybe you can walk us through just kind of introducing us to Memorial Church, their history, and where they are today and how they got there.
Yeah. So when we in the Diocese of Washington started kind of looking at this question, we realized that at this point in time, I mean, if you're here on this webinar, you probably know there's about 10, 15 years of history of institutions really trying to make an effort towards reparation. And there's a lot of them, and we've done some research on it, and with very mixed results, I would say. So when I was starting to write this book, and when I was looking towards examples, Memorial's name came up several times, and I knew Gray, and I asked him if he could kind of talk about the work they were doing. I want to be real clear. The process of working towards reparations is like finding a way forward on a road that no one has mapped out. Because no institution has ever actually done this to its fullness the way it needs to be done, right? And this is like a long history we're talking about. So the reparations and the terms that we're talking about, specifically reparations for this history of anti-Black racism, like that kind of begins basically 1865, when the Black community in Savannah met with General Sherman, and you have Garrison Frazier making this very specific, demand saying we are owed land, and that's where you get the 40 acres and a mule. In this particular conversation that we're talking, so that's like you're talking about almost 160 years there. In this particular conversation we're talking about with regard to churches, the kind of modern press of it comes with the Black Manifesto from the National Black Economic Development Conference. I think I got that right. In 1969, when they present this specific request to churches saying, like, this is owed, we need $500 million from predominantly white churches and synagogues. So in that long press, the actual follow through has been very limited. So I want to say that first, that anybody who's doing this work in any kind of serious way is sort of feeling their way forward to a goal that we know that God is calling us towards, but we don't quite know what the path looks like. And I lift that up, and I think that both Gray and the folk at Memorial would be the first to tell you this. I don't want to lift them up as having figured this all out, and they wouldn't want to do that. But there's a seriousness and an intentionality about how they've approached the work that I think a lot of congregations could learn from. And so I just kind of want to lift up a couple pieces that strike me as salient, as unique about what, maybe not unique, but unusual about the way Memorial's going about it, that I think are really important. The first is that they did begin with a deep process of personal introspection at the congregational level, of being like, where were we actually involved as a congregation? What was our actual history? And that piece, I think, is really important. And I would actually say that's something that initially we're working towards it, but we made some missteps with at the Diocese of Washington. There's an impulse when we're dealing with this, that the scope of this long history, this 400-year history of abuse and plunder through anti-Black racism, is so grand, enormous, that it's tempting, even as we're trying to face it and be honest about it, to sort of wave our hand and sort of say, we know we did these things. And there's a kind of erasure that goes on in that, right? Because we're talking about harms that happened to specific people and are happening to specific people in specific ways. And as we think about that work of apology and confession, and then working towards amends and repair, I mean, if you just think about it in your own personal life, when someone has wronged you and the experience of receiving an apology, we long for specificity. We want the person to recognize and acknowledge that these were the things that I did, and these are the ways that I think that I hurt you. Did I get that right? You know? And so that specificity is a necessary part of it. And Memorial did some real work looking at their own history of their institution and where it connected very personally. So one both painful and galvanizing piece of history they discovered is that one of the ministers who was working at the church right at that time when they began this work of reparation, one of her ancestors had been owned by the founder of the congregation, right? And so like that was it's a deep, immediate piece of personal connection. And they did some real work internally, kind of in that process of truth-telling, which is a necessary part of confession, in thinking about how to share that stories. Gray will tell you that they had to go back several times to kind of say, we're going to dig deeper into this history and tell it. That's one piece, I think, that they really did that piece. The other piece that I think is really important and significant is that they engaged the work relationally. And I think that's a really important thing to lift up. So what that meant for them is looking at local community institutions in their immediate vicinity. They kind of decided to focus in on their zip code to say, we're going to build partnership with these Black institutions, these Black organizations, these Black congregations, to figure out what their needs are, what they articulate as their needs, and to say, we want to make this reparation. What does it look like? How are we going to do that? That's really important for a number of reasons. One, I think one piece that's important is that these harms of anti-Black racism, when we look through the history of our nation, have always occurred in relationship. And I think that's an important piece to state, because oftentimes we think of, there's this vast gulf and divide between the Black and white community in this nation. But it's a divide of experience and a divide of equity, right? It's actually not a divide of contact, which often we think about and imagine it that way. And the reason that I would say the reason we think that there's this vast divide in contact is mostly because white people are the ones structuring the conversation. In this nation, because we're the levers of power, Black people have always had to interact with white people, whether it's like going to the bank or interviewing for a job, or early in the time, dealing with the slave master. Like, there was always this level of deep and uncomfortable intimacy, kind of perverse intimacy between the Black and white community. And it is in those interactions
raise
where
their
the harms.
children.
Exactly,
Often
right?
the ones raising the children and giving more
Right.
care to white children than to our own. You're absolutely right. Yeah.
Yeah. And so acknowledging that those harms have happened in relationship, we have to understand that the process of reparation is going to occur in relationship as well if it's going to have integrity. There's an element of accountability that's necessary there as well, so that the history of white individuals and institutions trying to take on the work of racial justice in this nation is fraught and involves a lot of like white saviorism and white people being like, we know what it is you need. And there's a paternalistic sensibility there. Engaging with communities, institutions, and individuals to say, okay, like, what is it that's owed? What is it that you need? What does it look like? Requires us to kind of surrender our own sense of what this problem is and to really hear from folks, this is what it looks like, and this is what we need, and these are the ways we've been harmed, and what restitution, how restitution is going to happen. And that will be particularized because there's not consensus, within the Black community of how this should work and what it should look like. So I think Memorial's decision to look locally is significant and important because locally, first of all, is where we're going to have the greatest capacity to actually build those relationships and the greatest capacity to actually shift the situation, where we have the most capacity to say, okay, we've got connections, we've got levers of power that we can push on, and we can invest in a way that is actually going to move the needle. And that's not to say that there isn't a bigger picture that we need to be engaged with, but working at a local level is going to kind of make sense. Memorial demonstrated sort of several times over a willingness to humble themselves in this process. And that meant several things. Oftentimes it meant giving up their own prayers. Their own prayers, their own plans is the word I was thinking of, sorry. Plans, but prayers of what this should look like. And so they had a bunch of ideas about how reparations should work. And several stages along the process, the community partners they were engaging with said, no, like that's not going to work the way you think it is. It's like, your idea is pretty and everything, but it's not realistic for what we need. And so we're going to push back and ask you to do something different. And Memorial was willing to hear that and to let go of their own kind of cherished plans to try something new based on what the community said, this is what we need. They were willing to change their own perspective on themselves, which was a big piece of it. So they had themselves as a mindset of, we're a very active church in this neighborhood of Bolton Hill. We're known here and everything. Only discovered through this process, when they began reaching out and making connections, that there was another Black Episcopal church just a few blocks away who had no idea who they were, right? And saying, okay, like that requires us to think differently about ourselves. And there was a process with that church of kind of letting go of hopes and expectations. They had this idea of being able to share ministers with them and kind of things like that. Memorial would pay for a minister that would be able to serve there and sort of things like that. And here the response from this congregation of being like, we worked so hard to be an autonomous congregation. We're not willing to do that right now. We're not willing to take that step, and maybe never will be. So that was a significant piece as well. Their willingness to surrender their own plans and expectations, I think, is really important. Another piece that I would look to is the substantive level of their commitment. So they've committed $500,000 and they are actually doing it. They're actually making these investments. They've committed $500,000 from their own assets. And I know they're doing some fundraising as well, but it's $500,000 from their own assets. And I think that's a really important piece, because part of what we're talking about when we talk about this financial aspect of reparations is acknowledging the history of plunder. So acknowledging that as individuals, but also as corporate institutions like churches, we have either directly or indirectly amassed wealth and assets through the impoverishment of the Black community. And it's those assets that we need to speak to, which requires this kind of process of surrender. So they said, we're going to go from our endowment. And they made what Gray will acknowledge was partly kind of an arbitrary commitment, but they looked at it in terms of a percentage value, which I think is significant. So they shot for 10% of their endowment, which was $500,000. I think that piece is actually quite important, particularly if we're talking about larger institutions like dioceses or universities thinking about what this commitment looks like. Because it's quite possible for a large institution to make a commitment that sounds impressive. Like an institution says, we're going to do $1 million, we're going to do $2 million, we're going to do $3 million, whatever, $10 million. But if you look at the institution's total assets, and what you're seeing is really a so small sliver, you're saying, okay, you're actually not getting to a place of significant impact or of significant commitment. So again, we look kind of at spiritual resources here, and we think about the story of the widow's mite. Jesus had this understanding that wealth matters based on the impact it has on your life. And so if you're able to give away $20 million and not have it affect the decisions you make in your institution, you haven't given enough. So Memorial gives $500,000 from figuring we're going to for 10% of our assets. I would actually suggest, and I suggest this in the book, that 15% of total assets, including real estate, is what we should be aiming for. But they still made a significant enough commitment that they really had to kind of think about choices that they were going to make going forward. Again, that gets to that piece of where your treasure is, your heart will be also. If you're able to give it away in such a that it doesn't impact you at all, you're not putting your heart there. So I think that's a significant piece. And yeah, so those are the pieces. And the last piece that I think is actually really significant about Memorial is that they took it on as an identity statement. This is our work of being a repairing congregation. And I think that's important too, because the biggest anxiety I have, the biggest danger I think we'd fall into when we undertake the work of reparations, and I've heard a lot of people voice this, and has happened several times, is that an institution will sign off a check, perhaps something that looks pretty impressive on paper, and then essentially say, we don't want to hear about it anymore. We paid it, it's over, it's done. And then it does become hush money, right? Then it does become like, this is the money so that you'll shut up about it, which clearly is not reparations. And so by stating, this is not a project we're doing, This is who we are as a congregation. There's that element of internal repentance and internal transformation that I think is absolutely essential. Because reparations for me is an unavoidable step on the process towards reconciliation. And I state that because I know we talk about racial justice in the Episcopal Church. We always like to talk about reconciliation. And I do want to let people, like I've had people push back on this. It is a goal that I have in mind. I just think there are a lot we have to do before we can even talk about it with any integrity. And continuing in that process to get where we need to be is not going, there's no one and done statement on it. It's going to become a lifelong process that we have to engage over and over again. One of the folks that I talked to in this book, Lindsay Ayers, who was policy counsel for DC Justice Labs, I asked her, like, what would your hope be for this process of reparation, like the end game? What do you want it to look like? And she said, I would hope that any institution that takes this on sort of becomes hooked by it, that this becomes something that you do, so that you deal with this one set of harms. You can say, we can document these things and we're working to make it right. And when you're done with that process, then you say, okay, and now what? Like, where do we look next? Where else has, where else has, have we not dealt with this problem? What are the other history that we haven't wrestled with? My mind is kind of blanking now, but there is a hymn, and I can't remember which it is, but we sing it at Christmas or something. It's a Christmas hymn where it includes about the grace of Christ going as far as the curse is found, all the way, like wherever this we can continue to dig it out and say,
joy to the world. Yeah,
that's it. Yeah, it was an obvious one, but yeah, as far as the curse is found,
far as wow, yeah.
And to keep like digging into it until we, and it's like some sense that's an apocalyptic goal. We say like the work won't be done until Jesus comes back, and we understand that and recognize it, but we take it on as an identity so we can continue to do this, day to day to day.
Yeah.
So those for all those reasons, again, I think they'd be the first to tell you there's some things that they still need to work on. There's some things they're still sorting out. But I think for all those reasons, there's a kind of intentionality and integrity around how Memorial has done this work. Oh, and actually one last piece I'd say. Because like the web of these harms of anti-Black racism and the plunder, extends so far and wide. Working at a local level is absolutely essential, but we also have to see how we're connected to that larger picture. So as much as Memorial's work has been very, very much at the local level, they've been evangelizing to the national church. They've been saying like, this is what we're doing, and we want to see other folks doing it as well. And so I think that engagement with the larger process, while your work remains local, engaging with the larger structures is really important too. So yeah, that's what I'd say. I think Memorial's doing really good work, and if anyone's looking for an example, I'd say understanding that they're still figuring it out. They're good folks to look at.
Amen. Amen. Even as we are doing this reflection, what I hear you pointing to, and maybe what I'll make a comment on, is that there really is so much for the church at large to learn from Memorial. And again, I've sat and listened to leaders from Memorial and feel like, yeah, there are a lot of folk out there who are talking about reparations, and a lot of dioceses who are really engaging around it, institutions engaging. And I agree with you that for my money, like Memorial doesn't have it all nailed down, but there are a lot of steps that they have taken seriously that I think anybody who wants to pursue reparations, I hope they would do the same. For instance, and you were naming this, but I just want to highlight this as well, that they didn't just wake up one day and say, how about reparations? They didn't even, and that sounds flip, but, sometimes, we watch the horrors of racism emerging all around us in the communities all around us. And of course, you want to know, what could we do? What could we do? And for some folks, it may be that the starting place is reparations. And what I love is while Memorial landed on our radar, for when they made their commitment to reparations, this was many years in the making.
Yeah.
They were, I think I've heard them say that like it was about 5 years before they ever put together something that was, and now for reparations.
Yep.
And so I think that long-term commitment sounds a lot to me like the long-term commitment that we make as the Episcopal Church toward becoming beloved community, where we talk about lifelong, life-deep formation. We say that we're not doing this so that one day, I will be able to check a box or to say, okay, racism's good,
All good.
Like,
Right. Yeah.
that day won't come in my lifetime, and we march on. We pursue this work. We pursue it as a spiritual practice that does not end. Much the same way that I don't look, as a Christian, I don't look for the day when I can stop praying. What would that mean? I don't look for the day I can stop going to worship. I don't look for the day when I can stop working toward beloved community.
Yeah, absolutely.
That long-term commitment that Memorial has taken on, I think, is a model for a lot of us.
Absolutely.
I feel like there's something, and again, you named this, and for me, there's a spiritual practice of kenosis that is self-emptying. And of course, the ultimate model of that kenosis, that kenotic path, is Jesus. And in Jesus, we see one who truly, we see one who says, all right, I've got all of the privilege of the Godhead, the privilege of divinity, and I'm going to surrender that in order to move into solidarity, to move into relationship, to be humbled. And that's the language in Philippians 2, the Kenotic hymn. Jesus takes on this humble path and invites us to do the same in order to discover greater life.
Yeah.
In order to discover greater life. And so there has to be that sacrifice, or genuine sacrifice, not just skimming off the top money or resources that didn't really matter anyway, but genuine sacrifice, a genuine self-emptying, humbling. And we do it, again, not just because we feel bad, not only just because we want to repair what's been broken. We do it because there is abundant life on the other side.
Yeah.
You find greater life when you're able to give up the things that you thought were life that really weren't. And those plundered assets, life built on plundered assets, that's not the fullness of life.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, I think that's very true. And I think we know that in our congregation. I mean, like, one very, like, I don't know, it feels very pedestrian way that shows up is, like, you have all of these churches, and it's like a trope right now. It is real, like, of our church buildings, and, like, hearing vestry after vestry complain about all of the, like, effort that we put in and money that we put into maintaining these edifices, right? And a lot of these edifices, whether it's directly or, like, indirectly, in the Episcopal Church, you can say, look, these edifices were built with plundered assets, either from slavery or from redlining, or, like, all the way down the line. And to say, like, are they really giving you life, right? And do you really want the end outcome of this asset to be the tomb in which you are buried? Or, and I you mentioned the kenosis, and I read your book, Church Cracked Open, and, like, you use the example of the woman who breaks open the alabaster jar and pours out. Like, or are we going to release them and trust that something will happen at that point? And I mean, I think a lot of our churches, like, if we really went through this process, would discover, like, yeah, there's a lot of pain, and, like, we have to re-understand who we are as a community. But in that process of letting go, would discover new life, and would discover a kind of joy and possibility. I do really believe that. So yeah.
And it's some of what you've described for Memorial when you were talking about how they've found an identity in this.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm actually, even right now, I'm sitting in a hotel room in Milwaukee, and I'm with ecumenical representatives from, like, I don't know how many, but so many different denominations, traditions, Christian traditions. And we're talking about racial justice. So I had to leave them. I was like, I'm going upstairs for a conversation about reparations. They can't wait for me to come back down and share what comes out of here. But one of the things we were just discussing downstairs someone was saying, he's like, but what you're describing, and I think there's a heart piece here, that, and you said yourself, like, we're talking about money and really the whole process around reparations, the truth seeking and the truth speaking that have that precede or accompany reparations. There's something that gets disrupted, something that gets unraveled in that process. And if we tell people, oh, it's not a big deal, like, no, the whole point is, no, this is a real sacrifice.
Absolutely,
and
yeah.
You won't just lose, you won't just have less access to your money. You will also be losing a narrative about yourself if you go through this process.
Yeah.
You will not be the city on a hill. You will not be the great savior. You will be an institution built on literally on the backs, on the bloody backs, on the scalped heads of entire peoples.
Yeah.
And so to invite folk to really sit with that is hard. And what we're saying to them, what we're promising, and I think it's why Christians have to be in this work, have to be in this conversation. What we're promising folks is, but you know what? Yes, there will be a loss. Yes, there will be this narrative understanding of yourself that will be dismantled. Something else can be born.
Yeah.
In fact, something else can only be born if you let go of your attachment to this identity, your attachment to these resources. That's why Jesus tells them, like, where your treasure is, there your heart is. His invitation is, put your treasure over here. Put your treasure, if your heart is with God, then put your heart and put your treasures with God. If your heart is with the people that God loves, the people who have suffered the most, the crucified classes, then put your treasure with the crucified classes. Those are easy words for me to say at 12:40 Central, on a Zoom call. I'm not going to say that I'm doing that personally, or that we as an institution, as a whole church, are doing that, but I know what the call is. And I know that the call is about us being remade into the image of Christ.
Yeah.
I can say it's hard, I can say all of that, but I can't say I don't know what the call is. I know what it is.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, I do a bunch of literary nerdy stuff in the book, but this is, I think it's really, I start off with this piece about, I start off with this piece about Claudius's speech in Hamlet, which I think you said speaks to, and Claudius's speech in Hamlet when he's in the confessional, and he's confessing his sin, but acknowledging, like, why do I feel like my prayers are fake? And he acknowledges it, like, right, because I killed my brother and I stole his crown and I married his wife and I still have all those things, right? And I'm trying to be forgiven. And as you said, like, it is important at some point to at least acknowledge what the call of discipleship is, and at least be honest. Like, you can say, like, the first step would be saying, like, I recognize this is the call. I am not willing to do that. And, like, that on its own would be a significant step, right? And then you can figure out where to go from there. And so, I mean, like, to acknowledge, like, this is required. And then we can figure out, are we going to do it?
Yeah.
So there's a piece that you raised up there, and I mean, so obviously, I think about my people a lot and how we engage with this. Do you mention that piece about the kenotic identity of, like, emptying yourself of this stuff and emptying yourself of the identity? And one piece I do want to lift up, because it is really, there's no way around the fact that it is not going to be painful work for any church that does it really well. The woman in our group and the diocese, Caroline Clam, who actually launched this all with a specific question. When we were beginning, and basically sort of said, like, let's try if we can take this on. We were asking, like, what would reparations look like? How would we know that we had, what's a standard or a metric that we could give that would give us some sense that we had actually done something, something. And she gave out these 3 criteria for what she wanted reparations to look like in the diocese. The first was that it would be doable. She said, I don't want us to give something pie in the sky that we know we're never going to accomplish. No, I was saying that like still ambitious. I want you to be real ambitious, but like doable. Second, that it would be substantive, and that fact that like this, whatever the transfer is, whatever the investment is, that we can see that it has actually moved the needle for at least some part of the Black community in this region. And the third, she said, is that, and it should hurt a little bit, because if it doesn't hurt a little bit, we haven't done it right.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to lift that up, and I acknowledge that. And at the same time, to acknowledge like the question of, well, why would you want to do it? And I think you speak to that. Like that's an important piece that like white folk and white congregations engage in this need to answer the question, why do you want to do this? And obviously part of it we can say is sort of Jesus says, like, this is how you take part in the kingdom, given where you're standing, right? And that's real. But there are other pieces as well that I think we can, that maybe specific what it means to take part in the kingdom that need to be lifted up. And you mentioned the identity piece. And I've experienced this myself, and I know a lot of white people who engage in any kind of work that crosses cultural boundaries experience this, is this sense of kind of being adrift. And this is why I'll tell you, I mean, this is the longest thing, but this is why we frequently engage in cultural appropriation. But it's a sense of being adrift when we encounter, in this country, when we encounter the cultures of the global majority of non-white communities. And we recognize in it this sense of groundedness in identity, right? Which, and I say this carefully because I don't want to get into the thing of like glorifying suffering or sanctifying suffering, but for people who have constantly encountered externally the statement like that you're not worth, you don't have the dignity of a person, that you don't have the worth of a child of God, people that encounter that have had to dig into themselves, dig into what they've received from their culture, from their ancestors, from their family and their community, to be able to make a clear statement. I am a child of God. This is specifically what it means. This is what it means. This is what I love about my people and about my community. I carry those things. And I can tell you, man, I've heard this, I've experienced this myself, and I've heard it from many people, like when we do these multicultural education gatherings. And you ask, like you'll sometimes do this thing where they split people off into affinity groups based on culture. And they say, like, what do you love about your culture, right? Everyone can answer that question except white people. Yeah. And white people like really struggle to be like, and here's what's going on, I would suggest. In this edifice of white supremacy that we've all bought into, we have sold the heritage of our identity as children of God and all of the cultural things that come with it for the pottage of white supremacy, right? And then we realize that like, oh my gosh, we like lost everything, which makes us clutch more. And so partly the kenotic thing you're describing, where we say, okay, like we've bought into these institutions that have been built up on the suffering of Black and brown folks and Indigenous folks, and we acknowledge that, and we're saying we're going to crack it open, we're going to release these things, and we want to take on something new, creates the possibility in the midst of it of really letting go of that identity and beginning to discover who are we actually as children of God, who are we as human beings, what are in fact the legitimate, genuine cultural assets and resources and knowledge of self that our ancestors have, which haven't been lost entirely, that we can reclaim and have that sense of groundedness that we kind of long for. Another piece in really practical terms, and like there's just tons of economic research about this, like probably most people on the call know this, there's abundant research that demonstrates that the safest, healthiest, and most stable nations and communities around the world are also the ones that have the highest degree of equity. When there's a high degree of inequity, you have unstable democracy, you have problems with crime and lack of safety, and a general lack of contentment across the board, right? And we have baked in inequity in this nation, right? We are never going to get towards the kind of equity that would grant us collectively stability, safety, freedom, and contentment unless we deal with that baked in inequity of the Black-white wealth divide. And there are other ones as well we have to attend to, but that one's like a significant one. So I think there's like deep spiritual identity and practical reasons why white people, white communities and congregations would want to take on this difficult work, painful work. It's going to be costly, but to accept it with the promise to be like, there was something better on the other side.
Yes, yes.
Well, thank you to both Canon Stephanie and Pastor Peters for this conversation. Pastor Peter, sorry, for this conversation. At this point, because we have only about 10 minutes left, I wanted to give some of the people who are joining us an opportunity to ask some questions. Just as a refresher, there's the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. You can feel free to type them in. We'll try to get to as many of the questions as we possibly can. We've actually had a number of questions about the practicalities from people who are at churches that are interested in thinking about starting their own reparations process. So I'll pose one of those questions, which I think gets at a number of things that people are asking, and that is, how did Memorial begin the process that ended with actually talking about reparations? What was the question they started with? Did they say that they wanted to look at their history or their place in the neighborhood or something else?
So there were some specific pieces of history, as I understand it, that they were engaged with and asking questions about. And as often happens in churches, the way I've heard Gray describe it, it began partly with their physical sanctuary, with noticing and recognizing that they had these plaques that were commemorating known slaveholders, that were commemorating known people that were proponents and to even after the Civil War, carrying up the cult of the lost cause, the Confederacy, and saying what's kind of going on there. And then having this one minister at the church begin digging into her own family's history and discover this connection. So I think for a lot of churches that really going to want to do this, a good place to start is investigating your church's specific history with anti-Black racism. And you may have to dig, depending. I mean, some churches it's not going to be hard to find, but you want to dig into questions of like, how was our church founded? Who were the founding members? Where was it founded? What did this neighborhood look like when we got here? What does it look like now? Do the demographics of our congregation reflect the community around it now? If not, why? What's going on there? Looking at patterns of development around your congregation and say, where do we show up in that? If there's significant grant money that helped found your congregation, where did it come from? Where did that church get their money or that diocese get their money? And to begin kind of digging into it there. And I think that piece is important because then you begin to identify, your own history and stake in it. And it's not so much a far removed thing, which will often, generate the response, well, that has nothing to do with us. It's not true, but it's easy for folks to say that. So I think looking at that history is significant and important. I would also encourage congregations. Sorry. No, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just going to chime in with you and say that what we've seen both with Memorial and other congregations and institutions is that work of truth seeking and truth speaking is so critical, and it really can launch an institution into that deeper work. But that the truth seeking about what is the story of this church or this institution around race, and then the truth speaking, actually learning how to name that, taking public accountability, kind of saying, this is who we've been, this is who we were. And then making a connection from that history to what's going on today. And that's some of what I just heard you describing too, Pastor Peter. But it's being able to say, okay, those are the things that happened before. What is the brokenness today that is actually a part of, there's a through line, an unbroken line from whatever that complicity around whatever the oppressive system might have been. At least for me, I feel like, yes, we need to be talking about slavery. I saw a question in the chat. We're also in different locations. They should be talking about anti-Mexican systems, for instance, in Texas. My goodness, like that in parts of kind of further north in Texas, into Utah, et cetera, it's anti-Indigenous. So and actually all over America, it's anti-Indigenous, of course. But basically being able to do that truth seeking, truth speaking, and to draw the line between what was broken on our behalf and what is still broken. Because this is one of the keys, right, Peter, is all the folks who say, but this doesn't have anything to do with us today. It's like, wait.
Yeah.
What was broken then is a part of why so much is broken today. So no, you didn't own slaves. Your family that you know of didn't own slaves. Maybe there was no slaveholder in the history of your church. that doesn't mean there's not complicity, and there doesn't mean there's not some work of repair that is yours to do. So anyway, so the truth seeking, truth speaking, making the connection between what's been done and what's still broken, and then discerning together, what does repair look like? And that's where then you can design whatever the reparations plan would be. But if your heart is not sufficiently broken by the truths you've discovered, then your plan for reparations will not be significantly ambitious.
So
go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. I was going to add to what Canon Stephanie mentioned. Actually, brings up a number of questions that have also come up in the chat. And that is many of our attendees are interested in how Memorial's reparations program is working now, where they're contributing their reparations funds, and the kinds of work that it's doing in the community. So could either of you speak to that?
I can a little bit. Stephanie, I don't know what you know about it, but they have. I just met him recently. They've hired a director of reparations who's actually an organizer from a local Black-led community group that's kind of doing this work to kind of decide what it's going to look like. And he's kind of putting them in touch with communities and organizations that are doing different pieces of economic uplift and development. One piece that they've done is around affordable housing, specifically around assisting organizations that are working to help with Black home ownership as a way towards actually kind of building wealth along the way. But generally, their tact has been basically, we're going to connect with these organizations, and we're going to follow your lead about what you think needs to be done. There is, in the heart of all of this work, there's a deep tension, which we've encountered at the Diocese of Washington, in terms of who needs to take the lead here. So my colleague Gail Fisher-Stewart said at one point to all of us, she's Black, to all of us who were white in the room, you made this mess, you've got to fix it, right? You've got to clean it up. And that is absolutely true. So like white organizations do need to not just sit back on their hands and say, hey, tell us what to do, but actually take the initiative. And at the same time, for the process to be legitimate, members of the Black community have to basically be directing, this is what the harms are, and this is what repair looks like. And so you have to kind of try and create a model that maximizes the agency of the Black community in determining what reparations will look like, and maximizes the responsibility of the white community in terms of actually making it happen. And that may sound onerous, but honestly, Memorial's found it to be a very life-giving process. So that's kind of what they're doing, is at each stage that they're engaging with these organizations and saying, you know, what needs to happen, and then figuring out on their end, okay, how do we actually put together the apparatus to make sure this transfer is working properly and all those pieces. So the other piece actually that I would say, I mentioned earlier about how do you get started. The other thing that I would say beyond looking at your history, and Stephanie, your comment about this is something that we'll do together, I would say is really important, is early on, like really when you just have the barest notion this is something you want to try, begin trying to reach out and form relationships with, and I would put it this way specifically, Black-led organizations that are working on liberation and economic empowerment in your local area, to reach out early on and say, this is something we're thinking of doing. Because once the tracks of what you're planning to do are laid, it becomes very difficult to change it. And that's where kind of like you'll get into more of that sense of telling the Black community what it is that they need. But engage early on, and it'll be part also of that kenotic thing that you were describing, Canon Spellers, because it does require, like, there's a generously humbling experience of going to folks and saying, like, we're doing this, we don't know what it looks like, but we're really committed to making it happen. And sometimes hearing people be like, I'm not interested in working with you, and then being like, okay, well, thank you for your time, and being willing to kind of make the next step and find someone else and ask the question again. So that's, yeah, I would say that. Build relationships early on with people outside your church, representatives of the Black community that are working on this.
So I believe we only have time for one more audience question. And actually, this is a question that's come up with a number of audience members, and it actually picks up on something that Canon Stephanie mentioned a few minutes ago. And that is that several people mentioned that the church has also been involved in the residential schools that Indigenous peoples were sent to, and has obviously not always had a positive relationship with Indigenous peoples. Is there something that the church could do to think about potential reparations for Indigenous communities that have perhaps been affected in the past by decisions that were made within the church?
I would
I have a thought about this, but go ahead.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I'll just say that I hope that we can do that. And in some ways, I feel like we've already taken a few of those steps. Some of it is simply even repudiating the doctrine of discovery, acknowledging publicly that we know our church's role in blessing the conquest of America and the not just exploitation, but the erasure, the genocide of Indigenous peoples on these lands. And so I think taking those steps, like doctrine of discovery, yes, but then doing work in your diocese, in your local area to find out who are the communities who have called this place home, who have been the stewards of this place, this land, and who are still the spiritual stewards, the ancestral stewards of this land. And how do you build those relationships? It's actually, the steps are not that different really from what Pastor Peter was describing. Doing that truth telling, finding out what was done here on behalf of our church, on behalf of European identified communities, period. What has been done here and what is still hurting here. And so there's that listening again, listening with Indigenous communities, being quiet, not coming in and saying, we know what you need. We're doing that. And actually our General Convention just this last summer of 2022, took some important strides toward truth telling, specifically around the Indigenous boarding schools. And then setting up the intention to do the healing work. First, we have to do the truth telling, and we have to figure out how many of these schools were there that the Episcopal Church is implicated around. And what are the stories? Some of the folks are still alive. So gathering those stories, hearing all about that, and then finding out what does repair, what does healing look like for Indigenous communities. Indigenous leaders throughout the Episcopal Church are already saying, we think that there need to be, for instance, spiritual care centers. We think that there need to be places where folk can reclaim their language. We think there could be this, we think there could be that. Getting the cues from Indigenous communities about what does repair and healing look like. And then ultimately, I do believe that the church needs to look at our resources collectively and to say, how do we participate in repair? And what is sacrificial giving look like when so much of what we have is plundered gain?
Yeah.
Well, thank you to both Pastor Peter and Canon Stephanie. And thank you to all of our attendees for joining. As I mentioned at the beginning, this conversation was inspired by the Reverend Peter Jarrett-Schell's book, Reparations, A Plan for Churches. Thank you for joining us, and we hope that you'll be able to join us for the next of these conversations sponsored by Church Publishing.
Blessings, everyone.
Thank you all.